everyone, and thank you for joining this session on mastering supplier negotiations. I'll be presenting today, and also my colleague Abe Chavez is going to be facilitating the presentation. I'm a consultant here at aPriori. What that means is I work with our customers to help them get value out of aPriori, and that can mean supporting them in discussions with suppliers as they're trying to figure out how can they work with suppliers to reduce the cost of a part. And it can also mean working with engineers to evaluate designs with aPriori to try and come up with more cost-effective designs. Before joining aPriori, I worked for a number of years for a division of GE in a variety of different supply chain and manufacturing roles. And a lot of that time was spent as a commodity manager. So the key takeaways that we want to cover today are what are the top 5 challenges in supplier negotiations and how can you address them, and how does having data help you address those challenges, and how can data instill confidence in your team when you're in negotiations with suppliers. We'll also talk about how having data can benefit the suppliers as well as the buyer in figuring out ways to reduce the cost of a part. So we're going to cover the top 5 challenges, and we're going to have interactive examples where Abe and I will do some back and forth to demonstrate how you can overcome each of the challenges. So what are the top 5 challenges? I'll kind of give an overview of all of them, and then throughout the presentation, we're going to go through them one by one. So the first issue is having data. So if you don't have any kind of benchmarking tool, and aPriori is one benchmarking tool, then you don't have any data, and it can be really difficult to negotiate from a position with very little knowledge about the part or the process. So aPriori arms you with some of that data. But then you have the issue of getting confidence in the data. So you've got this detailed estimate from aPriori, but how is aPriori getting that estimate? Where are all the numbers coming from? That can be a big challenge for customers who are using any type of should costing tool. They need to be confident and have an understanding of where the numbers in the should cost are coming from. The third challenge is getting the supplier to engage. So suppliers are just as busy as buyers are, and convincing them to come to the table to review some parts with you so that you can work together to try and reduce cost. The fourth challenge would be not getting distracted by discussing things that don't have a big impact on cost. So it can be challenging sometimes to focus your discussions with suppliers on key cost drivers. You don't want to get distracted by other things that may not have a big impact on cost. And then finally, the last challenge is perhaps one of the biggest. It's how do you reconcile differences between your estimate and the supplier's reality? So you will undoubtedly find out that the supplier is doing things differently from how a benchmarking tool has modeled it, and how do you reconcile those differences? So we're going to cover each of these, and we'll go give some role play examples for each. So first, let's talk about data. So having data can actually benefit both the buyer and the supplier. And if we think about trying to go to a negotiation with no data is one of the first challenges. So aPriori will put you, or another tool like aPriori will put you in a position where you at least have some data. Going into a negotiation without any data can be challenging for both the buyer and the supplier. Having data allows buyers to focus the discussion with suppliers on specific parts and specific cost drivers. They know what data to ask for, and they'll become more educated about the commodity that they're purchasing. So buyers or commodity managers, I'll use those terms interchangeably, they'll learn about the supplier's capabilities so they can better place parts with that supplier. Buyers, when they have some data, a benchmark estimate for a part, they won't be asking the suppliers to negotiate parts that are already competitively priced. And I never believe that suppliers are out to rip off a buyer, but I do believe that suppliers are human and they can make mistakes when quoting. So having some data, a benchmarking tool, might help you identify where there's just been an error in quoting, and you can work with the supplier to resolve that error, versus being in a position where the buyer is going to go and get a cheaper quote from another supplier and then just start going to that other supplier instead. So sometimes when your buyers and suppliers are reviewing detailed data and reconciling differences, they might find an error on either party's part. And then finally, comparing aPriori data to supplier reality can enable the buyer to uncover ways they can change their practices to actually reduce cost. So an example of this, and I'm sure many of you have experienced, let's say you are sourcing a part that's been around for a long time. You may be reviewing the part with the supplier, and the supplier says, well, you're missing this step, this process step that needs to be done. Someone from the buyer's organization told me 5-10 years ago that I have to do this step, and maybe that's not documented anywhere. So the buyer then enables the buyer to kind of go back and figure out, okay, do we actually need to do this? I think there are a lot of instances where the buyer can figure out something they can change on their end to help enable lowering the cost of a part, and having the data helps facilitate that discussion to find those areas for improvement. So let's look at a non-manufacturing example first, just to really think through how having some data can help you with the discussion versus going from a point maybe where you don't have aPriori, you don't have any type of benchmarking or should costing tool, and you're in a position where you have no data. So I'm going to start with a non-manufacturing example. Let's say the year is 1999, and someone is asking you, how long does it take, quote for me, how long it would take to get from Boston to New York. Now, I happen to be from the Boston area. I have family and friends that live in New York, so I travel this route a lot, and I would consider myself a subject matter expert in this route. And if you are not familiar with this route at all, your options would be to pull out the map and, figure out the distance, maybe assume that you're going 60 miles per hour, and come up with a time estimate. But what you don't know is how the time of departure might impact that, what different public transit options there are. You might not know the exact departure and arrival locations. What is the mode of transport? Is it driving? Is it flying? Is it public transportation? If your only source of data is being able to open a map and look at the route, you would probably have difficulty negotiating with someone like me, who I have a lot of experience doing this route, and I know all the different variables that can really impact the time it's going to take. So let's say you are hiring me to drive something from Boston to New York, and I say it takes 6 hours. You may not have a ton of data at your fingertips to figure out why you think it could be more or less. Let's fast forward to 2023, where we do have Google Maps, which has done us a favor, or other sources like Google Maps has done us a favor of actually aggregating a lot of data. So now all of a sudden, a person who's not from this area and doesn't drive this route a lot can account for some of the different things that I mentioned. You can look at different transit options, you can look at leaving at different times, and you can look at different routes. And so now everyone has this data at their fingertips, and they can make a more informed decision and get a better understanding of how long might it take me to drive this route, and what are the assumptions that are really going to impact the time. So the mode of transit is going to have a big impact. The time that I'm leaving at is going to have a big impact. So now we have data at our fingertips, and we can make get a more better understanding of all the variables that could impact the time to travel this route. Okay, so let's look at a manufacturing example now. So similar to what I mentioned with my driving from Boston to New York example, if you've got no Google Maps and someone comes to you and says, how long does it take to go here? You may be able to figure it out, but you have limited data to help inform that decision. Let's look at a manufacturing example. So let's say you're sourcing this part and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how long is this part going to take to make? Without any kind of benchmarking tool or being an expert in, let's say, injection molding yourself, it would be very difficult to figure out how long is this part going to take to make. What aPriori does, or other tools like aPriori, is they give you some data. So we generate how long we think this part is going to take to make, the final cycle time, and also share with you all the underlying assumptions of how we've come up with that value. So kind of like today when you would go to Google Maps and you'd put in New York to NYC, and you can pick different transit options, and you know that there's historic data that Google is leveraging. A tool like aPriori is providing you that for the question of how long does it take to make a part. So just having data at your fingertips makes a really big difference when you're engaging in supplier discussions. So if you don't have any data, you might go to a supplier and say, hey, this is my highest spend part with you, and I need to reduce the cost by 5%. And that's your starting position, and that's as much information as you have. But when you have a tool like aPriori, you have a benchmark to find parts where there's a big difference between the estimated cost and the quote, and you can start actually reviewing some of the underlying cost drivers. All right, so you've got all of this, you've got some data. I just showed on the last screen that aPriori generates, a number and reports a number of different variables that impact cost. But how do you know if the data that aPriori is giving you is reasonable? So if returning to my Boston to New York City example, Google Maps could spit out 1.5 hours, or it could spit out 6 hours. How do I know where on that spectrum I need to be? Well, in Google Maps, you can see all the underlying assumptions. So I'm going to propose that having confidence in the data comes from having confidence in the underlying assumptions. So if Google Maps is telling me it's going to take 4 to 5.75 hours to travel this, I can see, well, what time is it assuming I'm leaving at? What route is it assuming that I'm taking? I can look and see what would that be, if it's telling me it takes 4 hours, that what route was it assuming, what date and time did it assume I was leaving? If it's saying that it's going to take 1 hour, I can see what mode of transport it's assuming, that it's actually a flight, it's a nonstop flight. So I can become comfortable with the estimate of 5.75 hours with these assumptions, up to 1 hour with these different assumptions. So I think you need to do the same thing with aPriori. You need to dig into what are the assumptions of how I'm coming up with my 38-second cycle time. And you need to get comfortable. You need to understand what those assumptions are and build confidence that they're reasonable. And how can you do that? So how can you instill confidence in the assumptions in aPriori? So it's a two-step process. And the first step would be to identify the critical assumptions. So first, identify the things that have a big impact on cost, and don't spend your time validating assumptions that have little impact on cost. So I previously just stated that having confidence in the data comes from having confidence in the assumptions. If I return back to this slide, that's a lot of assumptions. So we've got material assumptions, we've got injection time. It would be very time consuming to go and validate every single variable. So what you're going to do is you're going to identify the assumptions that have a big impact on cost, and then you're going to spend your time vetting those. And we'll talk about how you can figure this out. And the work you put in here on identifying the critical assumptions will help you in the process later when you're reconciling differences with the supplier. So first part is identifying the assumptions that are critical to cost, and then the second part is validating those assumptions. So putting in the legwork to validate is the, if material, the part thickness is identified as being critical to cycle time for that injection molding part. Then you can put in the legwork to check, okay, well, what is the part thickness that aPriori is coming up with? Maybe I go and measure the part and see what the part thickness is there. The good news is typically this two-part process is required only once per commodity. So let's say that you are using aPriori for the first time for injection molded parts. Oftentimes the variables that are critical to cost are going to be the same across injection molded parts, or at least injection molded parts of like similar size or material. And so the legwork that you're doing to kind of validate understand the critical assumptions and validate that the assumptions make sense. Oftentimes you only have to do that once per commodity. But how can you validate this? So you see that, the cycle time is 38 seconds, you've got the dimensions of the part, you see that aPriori has data on, the material parameters, but how do you actually go about vetting those things? Well, there's a couple different ways you can utilize a variety of resources. So first of all, you may have an aPriori consultant who can help you identify the assumptions that are critical to cost. You could ask an aPriori consultant to share with you some of the logic behind the assumptions. Hey, what's the formula that you're using to come up with cycle time? How do you come up with the part thickness? Where are you getting the material properties? So your aPriori consultant can help you. You may have an internal subject matter expert in your organization. This could be a design engineer, manufacturing engineer, supplier development engineer, technician that maybe makes, similar parts in-house as to what you're sourcing. So you can get with an internal subject matter expert and say, hey, I'm looking at this part. It's got a large gap between the quote and the aPriori estimate. Can you help me, figure out for this type of part, what are going to be the things that are critical to cost? And help me see if, the aPriori's benchmark for them are reasonable, pass your kind of gut check. You can also do some research yourself. So again, We are in 2023, not 1999. So we do have the internet. So there's a lot of YouTube videos you can look up about how parts are made. You can go to different websites to look at material indices. You could look at distributor websites for buying material. You can look up things from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So there's a lot of research you can do. And part of that research is you can also play around with changing the assumptions and measuring the impact to cost. So if you can't find a publicly available index that's giving you the material rate, you can go in and try changing it. Or you're not sure about the material parameters that would be driving cycle time, just go in and change some of the parameters or change the cycle time and see how much of an impact that has to cost. And I'll show an example of that in a second. You can also use the supplier to help you identify these things. So you can start the conversation with the supplier, not necessarily from a cost perspective, but from an assumptions perspective. Hey, I'm trying to understand this part. This is the machine I think it's made on. This is the cycle time that I think it takes. Does this align with reality? Where am I different? You could also visit the supplier and see if you can see this part being made, and that might answer some of your questions. And one thing that I want to mention too is there's a lot of different options. It does take some time. So you might be asking a subject matter expert to sit down with you for 30 minutes or an hour to review a part. You might be researching processes to try and learn about them, but you're only doing this for the handful of parts that have a big gap between the a priori estimate and the quote. So returning back to how data, not having any data can be a challenge because you don't know what parts have potentially room for savings or negotiation potential. But when you have that data, you can isolate the parts that have a large gap between the estimate and the quote and spend your investigation time on just those. So let's look at a manufacturing example. So I had the question of how long does this part take to make? And this is a pretty big part, by the way. So I've got the dimensions here. It's about 1 kilogram. It's almost 1 meter long. And I've got some of the cycle time assumptions. So let's say, how could we validate some of these assumptions? So for one thing, we could try editing some of these assumptions in a priori and see how much impact they have on cost. We could go to Google, go to the internet. How do you determine injection molding cooling time? There's formulas that are out there on how to do it, and then you could compare that to how a priori is doing it. You could find the material properties for the material that you're interested in. So you can look for the data sheet and see if you can find these properties to validate what a priori has. You could go and measure the part, right? So one of the things we have is the wall thickness. And if you have consulted with a subject matter expert or with a priori, or if you Googled injection molding cooling time, you'll see that thickness is a cost driver. And so you could go out and measure the thickness of the part. And you could visit the supplier, right, and try to see this part being made. And I want to show you one example of editing the assumptions to see how big of an impact they have. So let's say that this part right now is 1725. And right now I've got a cycle time of 194 seconds. And I'm concerned that it might take longer. I'm not an expert on injection molding. I don't know just by the look of it if this, is a reasonable time. I'm going to try doubling it just in case a priori is missing something. So I want to test out what is the sensitivity of cost to cycle time. So I simply make the edit in a priori based on, what feedback I'm brainstorming that the supplier might have, and then I can recost it and I can actually quantify how sensitive the cost estimate is to cycle time. So if I go, you can see the labor time also changed with the cycle time, and you can see it went from 1725 to 3389. So it is quite sensitive. So now I know if I'm talking to the supplier and they say, hey, the cycle time is not 100 seconds or 200 seconds, it's actually almost double that. I already know ahead of time what that means for the cost of the part. And I know I'm going to have to really pay attention if the supplier mentions that because it is very sensitive. Let's look at another input. Let's say I'm having trouble finding a benchmark for the cost of ABS to validate this. So I want to see, what would happen if I was really far off on the cost of ABS. So I'm just going to change it to $8 per kilogram. Now, those of you who are customers know that a priori, we do use different indices for our material rates, but let's say you just want to test it out. This does not have nearly as big an impact on the total cost of the part as the cycle time did. Remember that part only weighs 1 kilogram, so even doubling the material cost from $4 to $8 only had about a $4 impact. So by going in and manipulating some of the inputs, I'm able to start developing for myself an idea of how sensitive is this cost of these different inputs. Okay, so let's talk about getting the supplier to engage. So you've got data, you've generated your a priori estimate, you've put in the legwork to understand for this commodity or this part, what are the things that are going to be critical to cost? And you've maybe worked with a subject matter expert internally, or you've done some online research to help vet the different assumptions that we're using. Maybe you've engaged with your a priori consultant. And now you feel really comfortable with your estimate. You're comfortable with the assumptions that it's using. So you want to talk to the supplier and start comparing the a priori estimate to their reality. So some tips to get the supplier to engage with you. So one is you can utilize your leadership team or executive team to set expectations that individual buyers or commodity managers are going to be having these types of fact-based discussions with suppliers before bringing specific parts. So going to the supplier and explaining what a priori is and showing them the parts that have a big gap is a lot of content to cover in a single meeting. You could utilize your executive team to give the message about cost transparency to suppliers through maybe an email, a supplier summit, just a quick initial phone call with the supplier, and then you'll schedule subsequent time to review specific parts. This can help, align the supplier's expectations and get them mentally prepared for the fact that you're going to be coming to them with some data and they're not taken off guard. Also, always be collaborative. So you can say, look, we want to improve the manufacturability of this part. We want to compare how you're making it to this benchmarking tool and see where we're different and see if together we can come up with ways to make the part better, or understand where our benchmarking tool is off. And you can focus the discussion on the manufacturing steps, potential manufacturing issues versus focusing completely on cost. You also need to explain to the supplier what is the benefit by reviewing the part, benefit to them by reviewing the part with you. Maybe the part's going to be increasing in volume. Maybe there are other parts of the same commodity type that you're going to have to source in the future. And so you want to align on assumptions for these types of parts now. Tell the supplier ahead of time what parts you do want to discuss. So remember, you're not asking them to discuss with you every single part. You've got the data, so you're able to identify parts with big gaps between the estimate and the quote, and you can tell the supplier, here's the 3, 4, 5 parts of the 50 that I buy from you that I want to have a little deeper dive on. When you do discuss, start getting into detailed discussions on specific parts, it's good to set timelines. You could set up a recurring weekly meeting with the supplier to review the part, but everyone is very busy, buyers and suppliers. And so generally with any project that you want to get done, it's important to kind of set timelines so that you all can be working towards an end goal together. And then finally, include a subject matter expert in the process if available. This could be a consultant from a priori, or it could be someone internal. So I mentioned already when we were talking about the validating assumptions piece that you might engage with someone to help you validate those assumptions. A lot of our customers have been very successful when a buyer can kind of bring in a technical person, and they can help them review the estimate ahead of time and support the conversation with the supplier in case it starts getting very technical. All right, so now I'm going to bring my colleague Abe in, and let's do an example of supplier engagement. And we're going to kind of role play some different approaches that you may take with the supplier, and you'll see some that will be more effective than others. I'm going to approach Abe. Abe will be the supplier and I'm the buyer, and I'm going to try a couple different approaches to get him to engage. Hey, Abe, following that meeting you had with our executive team, I've got a few parts that I want to discuss.
Sure, but let's do it in January because, it's the end of the year and you know how it is in manufacturing. We got to put parts out the door, so.
That's true, but I do have some new product launch parts that also need to be quoted, and we'll be looking to get those quoted before January. So I think it would be really helpful to align on some of the assumptions for these existing parts, because I think those assumptions will apply to the new parts I'll ask you to quote as well.
Okay, right. If it's gonna save us time, then let's do it.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second. So that I was able to kind of tie some of the review to some future NPI business. Let's try another approach. Hey, Abe, following the meeting you had with our executive team, I have a few parts that I want to discuss.
Yeah, can we focus the discussion on new parts, not the existing ones, just so that we can, save a little bit of time? Because, like it's the end of the year, and we are focusing on putting parts out of the door.
Good point. So you want to focus on the new spend only, but some of these existing spend parts, the volume is expected to go up this year, and we're going to actually be issuing more orders before the end of the year. So I really want to be able to get them reviewed because the volume will be going up.
Okay, all right. In that case, then we can also discuss the schedule to see what can we deliver to you this year.
Perfect. Okay, great. So let's pause there. So that was another example where, and I've seen this with suppliers where they kind of want to just apply this process to new stuff and not existing stuff, existing parts. But you want to make sure you're looking at parts that are significant for you and the supplier. And so, volume going up in the future would be something that the supplier would be interested in, and that you would want to make sure you have costs under control. Okay, let's do one more. Hey, Abe, following the meeting that you had with our executive team, I've got a few parts that I want to discuss. We've got this new tool that screens some of the parts, that screens the parts for potential manufacturability issues. And I want to see if any of the features that it's catching are causing issues for you.
That would be great, because some of these parts, frankly, are a pain in the butt to produce. So I'm eager to see what you got.
Perfect. Okay, I'll end there. So again, in that case, I didn't necessarily lead with cost. I led with that it's, screening for design for manufacturability. And can we discuss some of the things that it's screening, which ultimately, would be driving costs. And I'll probably be able to uncover if there's differences in, the routing that aPriori chose versus how the supplier is doing it. Okay, so now let's talk about focusing on cost drivers. So you will undoubtedly uncover differences between the aPriori estimate and the quote. But you want to make the most of you and the supplier's time by focusing on the assumptions which have a big impact to cost. So you want to be able to kind of keep these discussions on track to focus on cost drivers. And there's two ways to do that. So the first is the research that you already did to identify critical assumptions will help you and the supplier avoid getting sidetracked. So some of that homework or legwork that you put in before about figuring out for this commodity or for this part, what are the variables that are really important to cost and what are the variables that don't have a big cost impact. This will help you and the supplier not get sidetracked when you're discussing things. You may also find out that the supplier is adamant that something you thought had a small impact on cost actually has a large impact on cost. And that is a good finding as well, because then you can start reconciling differences and figure out, okay, why is this variable, let's say material cost, that I thought was not a huge impact on cost, the supplier is telling me that it is. Maybe their rough mass is much higher than aPriori had estimated, and why is that? And you can start digging into that. The other thing that can help you focus on cost drivers is getting cost breakdowns. We're going to come back to this one in a second. I want to give an example of not getting sidetracked by focusing on cost drivers first. So we're going to come back to this example that we looked at before, where I tested out, remember I tested out changes to material cost and to cycle time. And I saw that the estimate was much more sensitive to changes in cycle time than material cost. So Abe's going to help me again, and we're going to do another example of redirecting the conversation based on cost drivers. Abe, I'm getting pushback from my management team on the cost of this part. We've got this new benchmarking tool that estimates cycle time, material cost, and the estimate we're getting is very different from the quote. So I want to validate some of the assumptions that the tool is using to make sure I'm using the correct inputs. So for example, we're estimating material cost of $4 per kilogram and a cycle time of 90 seconds. How does that compare to what it is for you in reality?
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting the $4 a kilogram from, but if you can buy it for that, just drop ship me the material, because I pay about twice that for that material.
Oh, okay. No, that's really good to know. So you're paying twice that, so about like $8 per kilogram. Okay, so I have to keep that in mind, and I'll see if we could drop ship something. But one thing I'm thinking is this part, it's big, but it only weighs about like a kilogram. So $4 a kilogram versus $8 per kilogram on a 1 kilogram part, that should be like a $4 difference. But the estimate that we're coming up with is like $20 cheaper. So there must be something else going on too. What size machine are you using for this?
I believe this part goes on a 5,000 ton machine.
Oh, okay. I have it being done on a 3,000 ton machine. Would that not be capable for this part?
Yeah, no, I think I remember this part because you're right. If it was just pressure, then only a 3,000 ton would be required. But the mold size on this part is too big for a 3,000 ton machine. So we actually could not use a 3,000 ton machine. We had to use a 5,000 ton machine.
Okay, got it. So we'll end it there, and I'm going to come back to this example where we've uncovered that they're using a different size machine. Okay, so I mentioned that the second thing, your research to identify cost drivers will help you in the negotiations, as you just saw. The second thing is getting cost breakdowns. Getting cost breakdowns can really help identify major gaps between the estimate and the quote. It can help you and the supplier ensure that you're focusing all of your energy on those gaps. And they really can often help the buyer learn ways that they can change what they're doing to lower cost. So for example, if you've just got an aPriori estimate and a quote, let's say there's a $50 gap. There's a lot of assumptions that you need to run down. You have to look at the material cost, the cycle time, secondary processes. If you get a breakdown, even a breakdown of material cost versus manufacturer cost, you may be able to identify that you and the supplier are already aligned on manufacturer cost, for example. And then you can make the most of you and the supplier's time and simply discuss material costs. Now let's look at a manufacturing example. So this is an assembly. And we can see we've got the aPriori estimated cost for both the assembly, this is a weldment, and the different components. And we've got the aPriori cost per kilogram and then the total subcomponent cost. And then we've got the same quote. So we've got basically a costed bill of material from the supplier for the quote. So we can see that there's a sizable gap between the estimate and the quote, and that most of that gap is on the assembly operations, the welding. So I know going into my discussion that most of the gap is here, and so I want to focus my conversation there. So let's look at this example again with Abe, and we'll kind of show the power of a breakdown and focusing on cost drivers and how having a breakdown enables you to really focus on cost drivers. Providing the costed bill of material for this assembly, I'm noticing that our estimate for the assembly cost is really different from the quote. And so I want to dig into that. I'm wondering, what's the longest assembly operation for you?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk to you about this assembly as well, and thank you for sending me your estimate, because we noticed that your material rates again are way off. They're much lower than they really are. Where are you getting those from?
Oh, okay. I'll definitely have to figure out the exact source for that. Although it seems like the overall estimate for the component costs is not as far off from your quote as the assembly process is. Most of the gap that I'm seeing is in the actual assembly process. So we'll definitely look into the material rates, and that can be something we can update going forward, but I don't think it's causing a huge gap on these parts in particular. But most of the gap is from this assembly operations. And I thought that most of the time, most of the assembly cost is in the cost of the welding. Is that the case, or are there other operations that drive a lot of time for you?
Well, yes, the welding is a significant portion, but it's also the grinding, because we have to blend one part into the other, and just to make it look like if it was one part, basically both of them over the weld, and that takes a significant amount of time.
Okay, yeah, we were thinking that the grinding time would be basically a fraction of the welding time, but it sounds like it's quite long. I'm surprised we need so much grinding in the blending of one part into the other for this assembly, because once this goes into the bigger assembly, you can't even see the welds anymore. So let me check with engineering if we really need that nice of a finish on this assembly.
Sounds good. That would be great, because then the grinding time would be a fraction. It would be like a quarter of what it is now.
Great. All right, so let's end there. So that's a good example, because I was able to uncover a difference in how it was being modeled, and we may actually be able to find a design improvement that could truly reduce the cost of the part. If in fact you can't see this assembly at the end, maybe whoever designed the part put on that finish, but we don't really need it at this level of the assembly. Okay, so let's talk about now reconciling differences. So let's, for example, like in that last example that Abe and I did, you find out that the weld grinding time is different from aPriori's estimate. Or in the previous example where we talked about the injection molded part, you find out that the machine being used is different from your assumption. How do you handle it? How do you proceed when you do uncover a difference? And for me, this can be the most overwhelming part, and it's really where the rubber meets the road, because you've generated the data, so you've got a benchmark, you've done your homework and you've validated, you've identified the key assumptions driving costs, and you've validated those maybe with an aPriori consultant or an internal subject matter expert or some of your own research. You've got the supplier to the table, which can be a major hurdle. So let's say you've got the supplier to the table. You've been able to direct the conversation to focus on assumptions with a big cost impact. Now you've found a difference in one of those assumptions that has a big impact. Now what do you do when you found a difference? So you found a difference. How do you know if it's the root cause of the gap, and if you should accept, the difference of assumption? So first, you found the difference. Then you need to decide, is the way the supplier is doing it fair for both parties, both me and the supplier? If I don't think so, if I think the supplier is telling me something that I don't think is fair, then I can discuss it with them. So an example of this could be, hey, I found out the supplier is using a different machine to run this part than I expected, and it's because they don't have capacity on another machine. Maybe there is something we can come up with to open up more capacity. Maybe I can change the way my ordering pattern. Maybe we can look at investing in new equipment. Maybe I would want to discuss that. If the supplier tells me something I think it is fair, for example, the weld grinding, right? They say, hey, it takes this long to grind the welds because you've got a note on your drawing that it needs to be, polished smooth. And maybe I validate that with a subject matter expert, and they say, yep, that would really add a lot of time. Then I don't have to just accept the price that the supplier is giving yet. I'm going to accept that they've got a different assumption, and I'm going to agree with the way that they're doing it. Now I need to test if accepting that assumption will close the gap between aPriori's estimate and the quote. So I just go into aPriori and I update that assumption. So let's say I change the weld time, and then I measure, does that close the gap between the quote and the estimate? If it does close the gap, then I am in a situation where I do have to accept the price. If it doesn't close the gap, then it gives me a mechanism by which to continue the discussion. So I can say, okay, look, I understand that it's a long time to grind these welds. I've updated my estimate with the time that you mentioned, and I'm still seeing a gap. So can we talk about another couple assumptions to see if there's anything else that we're doing differently? So it gives you a mechanism by which to continue the conversation. Okay, so let's go back to this example. Remember, Abe and I talked about this earlier, where aPriori was estimating a 3,000-ton machine. Remember, this is a pretty big part. And the supplier said, Abe said, well, I have to do it on a 5,000-ton machine because the dimensions of the mold can't fit on any of my 3,000-ton machines. And let's say I do a little due diligence. So maybe if I was the buyer, or someone, in my organization might have a record of how this mold was designed when we purchased it. I could look at the dimensions. I could go to the supplier and see the dimensions of the mold. And then I could Google some different 3,000-ton machines and check the maximum dimensions that they have. I could talk to a subject matter expert, so I can probably do some due diligence to figure out if, okay, I'm on board with what they're telling me. It does seem that this mold is too big for a 3,000 ton machine. So I've decided that their assumption is valid. Now I can go into aPriori and I can make the change. So remember, Abe also mentioned the material cost. I was able to redirect on that, but I do need to keep that assumption in there as well. And I'm going to go in and pick manually pick a larger machine that's in line with what Abe's telling me. So now I've got the two assumptions. So one, Abe mentioned the higher material rate. I had that one accounted for. I accepted it because I knew it wasn't a major cost driver anyways. And now I've changed the machine. And you can see the cycle time changed a little bit, probably different mold open and close time. I could dig into why. And then I've got a much higher overhead rate now. So then I can evaluate if this does close the gap between the quote and the aPriori estimate. Now, let's look at one more example. So let's say I've got a part where the estimate is $18 and the quote is $31. With the help of an internal subject matter expert or aPriori consultant or my own research, I've identified these as the key drivers of cost: the material cost, the yield, the cycle time, and a 150-ton machine. So let's do one more role play example where Abe and I are going to work through reconciling some of these differences. So as you know, we've been using this benchmarking tool. We've looked at estimates. We've looked at estimates from it in the past.
Yeah, no, I know the drill now.
Okay, great. So I've got another part where the estimate is $18 and the quote that we're paying is $31. So I just wanted to go through some of the key assumptions and see where we might be misaligned. So I'm assuming that the material cost is $4 a kilogram. It's made on a 150-ton machine, and the cycle time is about 128 seconds. What do you have on your end?
Yeah, no, this is a proprietary resin, so it's a little more expensive than the generic, basically. So this is more like $6 a kilogram. The cycle time is a bit longer because you require a special finish, and so it's about 170 seconds. And because of that finish, our yield is about 90%. We have to throw away about 1 pound in 10, basically.
Okay, so we heard a few differences from Abe. So we've got he's proposing a different material cost, a different cycle time, and a different yield. The machine that he gave, he didn't have any issue with the machine, so we think that's right. So we've identified 3 assumptions where we're different. So there's 3 things we need to reconcile. So remember our workflow. When we identify assumptions, different assumptions, we need to decide if we think the supplier's assumption is fair for both parties. That's the first step. So let's go through each of these one at a time. The resin cost. Do I think that this is fair? How could I validate this? I could go try and look up plastic news. I could see if my company also buys this material and see what the price is. I could look if I've gotten quotes from other suppliers recently where they've shared the price. So there's a variety of different things I could do to try and research this. I could also go in and change the resin cost in aPriori and check how sensitive the cost is. And if there's not a big change, then I can say, okay, well, this part only is 1 kilogram, so there's not that big a change if my resin cost is a difference in 2 kilograms. For cycle time, how could I vet this assumption? Well, first of all, let's note that the cycle time, 170 seconds versus 128 seconds, is actually not a huge difference. I could certainly pull in a subject matter expert. I could start looking at the material properties, measuring the thickness of the part. If it's not a huge difference, I could also just accept what the supplier is saying here because it's you know, within reason. It's not a huge margin of error. And then finally, the yield. So I could, go back to my engineering team and see if they've ever had, any discussions with the supplier about yield. Again, I could talk to a subject matter expert about difficulties making this part. I could see if aPriori picked up any difficult to manufacture features. And let's say that I do decide that I agree with the supplier's assumptions on all of these points. Let's say I do my homework and I decide, the supplier is valid on all of these points. Then I can go into aPriori and make the updates. So as you saw in the videos that I showed earlier, I can go in and I can update the resin cost. I can update the cycle time. I can update the yield. And my new estimate, with assuming all of this data from the supplier is correct, is $21. And this is adapted from a real customer example. This happens a lot. So now I have a mechanism to go back to the supplier and say, okay, I see what you're saying. I agree with your assumptions. Now my estimate is $21 compared to the quote of $31. And now I can go back to the supplier and I could say something like, you know, what else might I be missing? Our labor rate is $28 an hour. Our overhead rate is $122 an hour. So I can share then the next level down of assumptions that would make a big difference. And in many cases, then the supplier may end up re-quoting. They may go back and, like I said, sometimes they find an error on their side that they were, you know, using an incorrect rate, or they quoted in such a rush that they overquoted it. And so sometimes what happens is the supplier may just come back and re-quote, and oftentimes you kind of land somewhere in the middle from your original estimate in the quote. So in summary, the top 5 challenges that we talked about were having data in the first place. I mean, knowledge is power. And so going into cost discussions with no data on cost is a very difficult starting point. So having a tool like aPriori at least gives you some data. But once you have that data, then a huge challenge is being confident in it and leveraging experts either from aPriori or internal to your organization, doing some of your own homework and research to understand the underlying assumptions can make you more confident in them. And that is hugely powerful when you're in, just again, when you're in discussions with cost. Getting the supplier to engage can be difficult. You really have to frame it, what's in it for the supplier? How are they going to benefit by taking some time out of their busy schedules to review some of these parts with you? And you want to focus those discussions because you are all busy. You want to make them as efficient as possible. You want to focus your discussions on the cost drivers. That means you need to invest the time up front to understand the critical to cost items, and getting a cost breakdown can help you and the supplier make your conversations efficient, and it can really help the buyer identify areas where they can change potentially what they're doing to reduce cost. And then finally, one of the last challenges is when you find out there is a different assumption. So the supplier has a different material rate, a different cycle time, and a different yield rate. You can discuss those as different assumptions with the supplier. You can go back to your, experts or the research you did to vet is how the supplier is doing it fair for both of us. If you decide it's not, then you can discuss that difference. If you decide the way the supplier is doing it is valid, then you update the estimate on aPriori and see if it closes the gap. If it does close the gap, then you maybe need to evaluate, is there an update you need to make in the digital factory? Or you can go back and continue the conversation if it doesn't close the gap. Thank you all for your time today. This was a lot of content, but I really think that this covers a lot of areas that we see customers have challenges, and that you'll feel better equipped to tackle negotiations and discussions with suppliers going forward.